Thank you. Thank you very much, Craig, for that wonderful introduction. And I do stand here very proud of and grateful for my public education. Your public education never really leaves you. I was actually in thinking about what I'd say for you tonight. I recall that late last year I was at the Sydney Opera House with the Australian Philharmonic Orchestra, a little bit nervous to be conducting an orchestra of that magnitude, with Anthony Kalia and Sylvie Palladino and a 200-voice choir, and they're all singing. It was the lead-up to our grand finale leading into New Year's Eve, and they're singing, "Glory, glory, hallelujah, His truth is marching on." It was all very moving for everybody. And in my mind, I'm hearing, "Do your best and try your hardest for Bel Air Primary School." So it never really leaves you. I was trying to think about how I could encapsulate, for me, 12 years of life in a 5-6 minute speech, and of course it's impossible to do that, but I just wanted to recall a few of the key moments in my life at school. I did start off Bel Air Primary School, the local primary school in Newcastle, then Katara High, which was the local school again in Newcastle, and then, as Craig mentioned, I was lucky enough to attend the Conservatorium High School, a fantastic selective public school here in Sydney. And, okay, so year 1 or 2, there was a teacher at my school who realised I was a very shy kid, but I loved music. And Miss Williamson got me to play the organ with the school assemblies and the school choir, and I felt a great sense of purpose. Even as a little person, I felt very important, and the teacher obviously could see that this was good for me as an individual little person. I also recall in year 11 having a bit of an argument with a maths teacher. I said, "Look, I'm a musician. I only want to be a musician. Musicians only ever have to count to 4. Why, or 5 in the case of the wind ensemble earlier tonight, why do I need to learn about maths?" And she said, "Well, if you can solve these complex algebraic equations that I'm presenting to you, your brain will improve. You'll be a smarter person." And immediately I was tuned into the idea of maths. This very wise teacher, just with a few words, tuned me into the joy of mathematics and the challenge of that. I remember in year 2, Mrs. Norman was our teacher in second class, and she read, actually, it's remiss of me, I should have begun by acknowledging the traditional owners here, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and to pay my respects to the Aboriginal people and the elders past and present. And I do that not really as lip service, but I'm recalling when our teacher in year 2 began telling us the stories of the Aboriginal Dreamtime. And I remember finding these absolutely mesmerising and beautiful. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that seems, these were stories about how the world came to be. And I remember thinking, this is just as plausible as the Adam and Eve, snake and apple story that I heard last year. I wonder which one is correct. And so even as a 6-7-year-old, my very wise public school teacher got me thinking, questioning, looking at the evidence and looking at the world from various different perspectives, different points of view. And that's something for which I'll always be grateful. In fact, I'm thinking about year 2 and Mrs. Norman, and I remember, I know every teacher in the room and every principal will be familiar with this line of argument, but I had begun colouring in when I wasn't supposed to. I thought we were allowed to start colouring in, but that Mrs. Norman said to me, "Look, why have you started colouring in?" I said, "Well, David said that it was okay for us to start." And she said to me, "Well, if David told you to walk over the edge of a cliff, would you?" And I was flummoxed. This is the most brilliant argument I had ever heard. And I went home to my dad, who is an educator, and I'm very excited to say he's just got an AM. He's picking it up tomorrow for his services to education. And he said to me, "Well, look, the next time Mrs. Norman presents that argument to you, what you need to say is, well, yes, you're quite right. If David told me to walk over the edge of a cliff, I wouldn't. But Mrs. Norman, if you told me to walk over the edge of a cliff, I wouldn't do it either." So I'll make my own judgments. I think that my dad probably enjoyed his interactions with the teachers through me, possibly at my expense from time to time. But I also recall very fondly Year 10 at Katara High School. I just heard of this new show called The School Spectacular, and it sounded absolutely fantastic. The orchestras, the choirs, rock bands, it was televised, and I thought, I want to be part of this, but I can't see any way for me to be part of this. I'm a jazz piano player from Newcastle, they're not going to be interested, and I decided that I wouldn't audition. And Mr. Wild, Terry Wild, in Year 10, said to me, well, what have you got to lose? You'll take 10 minutes out of your lunchtime, and if you don't get in, all you've lost is 10 minutes out of your lunchtime. You're no worse off than you are now. And to a 14, 15-year-old, again, this was a revelation, because I was so consumed with the fear of failure that I didn't want to do this in case I was rejected. So I went for the audition, and very happy to say I got into the School Spectacular. I played a solo at the School Spectacular, and that moment changed my life in so many ways that I can't even begin to list them. On a very obvious level, it put me in front of people, just the same as Anya Nissen, with a magnificent performance here tonight, has now been seen by Minister Garrett, who was sitting there saying, wow, she's just amazing. And so now, you know, more people have seen her thanks to the public education system and our celebration tonight. For me, the School Spectacular was that same moment, and without going into the detail, we don't have time for that, but that School Spectacular performance led to my meeting people, that led to my meeting other people, that put me in contact with Bert Newton when he did a show up in the Twin Town Services Club, which led to my working with him on Good Morning Australia, which of course led to Australian Idol and the Logies and everything else that happened since. So I can very specifically and directly relate pretty much my entire career to the very wise words of my music teacher back in Year 10. But even on a more subtle level than that, the obliteration of my fear of failure by those wise words has stayed with me, so that many years later, when I read in a magazine that every musician worth their salt was submitting a song for the Sydney Olympics, I thought, well, what have I got to lose? I remembered my teacher's advice, and I went ahead and wrote a song, and I'm very glad that I did, because that was another moment that changed my life. And again, I can relate that right back to my experience at school. The other thing that I'm very grateful for is the fact that my parents made the choice to send myself and my sister and brother to public schools. It's a choice that I'm very proud of, and I'm very grateful for. And I don't know that it's appropriate for me probably to get into the private versus public school debate, because I'm not a politician and I don't really feel qualified to talk about that specifically, except that I did hear just recently somebody on Talkback Radio in Melbourne talking about the burden of public education on the on the finances of the government. And again, in this morning's paper I was reading about the burden of public education as well as many other things. And I just think that it's important that we resist and reject the use of that word burden when it's describing public education. I don't want this to sound like a slogan, but I really mean it if you think about it, that money spent on public education is an investment rather than a burden. And that does sound like a soundbite, but if you think deeply about it and look at the evidence here on stage today with that wonderful recipient of the Friends of Zainab Award and the changes that it's made in his life, you look at Anya Nissen and you see the sort of changes that the School Spectacular and public education have made in her life. And I look at the School Spectacular, I suppose, as a really great microcosm for our public education system. At the elite level, you can see the most brilliant orchestral musicians, the most fantastic singers and dancers being given the opportunity to be even better. And I guess those students are representative of the science student that's encouraged to go on and hopefully discover a pain-free and chemotherapy-free cure for cancer in some time. The money spent on that child's education is obviously money well spent. At the other end of the spectrum, you might have, and again, we've seen this with the School Spectacular, students who come from difficult backgrounds, whose lives are in danger of going off the rails. An insightful teacher might direct that student towards the dance ensemble or the rock band or the school cricket team or the drama class or whatever. And I don't think there's any way to really quantify the value that we as a society get from those sorts of interventions. I was speaking before the show today to one of the people on the board here of the Public Education Foundation who used to run a school band for performers or students who came from disadvantaged backgrounds, and he said, you know, they're now all in their 40s and they've all turned out to be living happy lives, well-adjusted people, and one can only imagine what their lives might have been like had public education not been there for them. And I guess in summing up or in closing today, there's a few things I want to say. First of all, I want to invite you all and encourage you all to come along to the 30th Annual School Spectacular this year. As I said before, the reason I keep coming back to the School Spectacular is because of the incredible difference it made in my life. And every year we can see that same sort of difference being made in the lives of every student that participates in that event, from the most elite to the kids in the choir to the kids that are running around putting the staging together. It's been described as the world's biggest classroom, and I'm very, very proud to be associated with that event, and I hope you'll all come along this year. To the teachers and the principals, I offer my sincere gratitude and congratulations for the work that you continue to do. And to the students, particularly those receiving awards tonight, one thing the private schools do pretty well is they stick together and they support each other, and they're able to sort of network, and I think that's really good, and that's something that I think we can do more of. Just today, I caught up with somebody who I met through the School Spectacular, who's now a very talented scriptwriter, and so we're hoping to collaborate on something. I think this is the sort of thing that public schools should be doing more of, and in fact, to those students who are receiving awards now, the baton passes to you to be out and about in the community, shouting from the rooftops how grateful and proud you are of your public education, and to remind people that public education needs to and hopefully will continue to be the solid foundation on which the future of our country is built. Investing in public education is really investing in the intelligence of our country, and I can't think of a better thing to do than that. Thank you very much.